The wedding ring had a small imperfection on the inner band, a tiny ridge of gold that the jeweler had called a character mark, and that Elliot had called proof that nothing worth having was ever perfectly smooth. Nora had run her thumb across that ridge 10,000 times in the 14 months he was sick. She ran it across, now sitting on the front steps of the house on Elm Street, watching her children play in the patchy late afternoon light that fell through the oak trees lining the sidewalk. The trees were old, older than the neighborhood, older than the houses around them, older than any of the troubles that had planted the three of them here on this cracked concrete step with their secondhand furniture and their grief packed into boxes like everything else. Wren was in the backyard. Nora could hear her daughter's footsteps moving in the rhythm that meant she was pacing while she thought, which meant she was processing something in the way she always processed things, through movement first, then image, then color. In an hour, there would be a drawing. In a week, there would be a painting. Nora had learned to read her daughter's emotional weather through the art that followed every storm. Cade was on the front sidewalk, methodical and quiet, sweeping leaves away from the base of the steps with a broom that was too tall for him. He had found it in the garage that morning and had immediately put it to use without being asked. That was Cade, 10 years old and already carrying the kind of responsibility that grown men spent decades trying to avoid. Nora turned the ring. She thought about the library. She always came back to the library when the weight of everything else became too much to hold. Not because it was a happy memory, though it was, but because it was the moment before everything complicated. The last clean breath before a life that was beautiful and hard and devastating and worth every single second of it. She had been 22, a graduate student in American history with a fellowship that covered tuition and a stipend that did not cover much else. She had discovered early on that the third-floor reading room of Whitmore University's main library was empty on Friday evenings because everyone with a social life had somewhere better to be. She did not mind that. She had a chapter to outline, and a cold cup of coffee and a stack of primary source documents about the New Deal that she found genuinely, unironically interesting. Elliot Calloway had walked into that room at 8:47 in the evening, carrying an architectural drafting portfolio, a biography of Louis Kahn, and the expression of a man who had assumed he would be alone and was mildly surprised to find he wasn't. He had stood in the doorway for a moment, just long enough for Nora to notice him and look back at her documents. She had not thought much about him in that first second. Tall, dark jacket, the kind of quiet that came from confidence rather than shyness. Then he said, "You're in my spot." She had looked up again. He was not annoyed. He was almost smiling. "I didn't see a name on it," she said. "It's an unwritten rule. I've been coming here every Friday night for 2 years. I've been coming here every Friday night for 4 months. I think that makes it my spot by more recent and therefore more urgent claim." He had set his portfolio down on the table across from her, pulled out the chair and sat down. "That's a genuinely creative interpretation of property rights," he said. "Are you a lawyer, historian?" "Worse," he said, and opened his book and smiled at the page. She had not meant to keep talking to him. She had a chapter to outline. But there was something about the way he sat, unhurried, fully present, like a man who had made peace with wherever he happened to be, that made the silence between them feel less like the absence of conversation and more like the foundation of one. By 10 o'clock, they were sharing the cold coffee and talking about whether cities shape people or people shape cities. By 11, they were still talking. By midnight, the library was closing, and she had not outlined a single paragraph, and she did not care even a little. They were married 3 years later in a small ceremony at a botanical garden that Nora chose because she loved the way the afternoon light came through the glass ceiling of the old greenhouse. Elliot had said she could choose anything, and he had meant it. He was like that. Genuinely structurally generous in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the person he had decided to be. His family was a different matter. The Whitfields had been in Connecticut for 4 generations. Constance Whitfield spoke in the clipped, confident syllables of a woman who had never once questioned whether she belonged in a room. Her husband Harlan was quieter, more measured, but the weight of his disapproval was no less real for being delivered in lower tones. They had built their fortune in commercial real estate and had grown the kind of expectations that come from never being told no by anything except the market. And even then, only occasionally. Elliot was their only child, and Elliot had chosen a woman who taught public school history and grew up in a house with one bathroom and a father who fixed other people's cars for a living. The Whitfields did not say this was a problem. They were too careful for that. What they said was that they simply wanted what was best for their son. What they said was that Nora seemed lovely, of course, and that education was a noble profession. What they said at that first dinner in the Whitfield dining room, with its oil portraits and its silver candlesticks, and its silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath, was that they hoped Nora would eventually feel at home here. The way Constance said eventually told Nora everything she needed to know about the timeline they were working with. Elliot had seen her expression across the table and pressed his knee gently against hers. She had looked at him. He had looked back with an apology in his eyes and something steadier underneath it, a certainty that needed no words, a decision already made. He had chosen her. He kept choosing her every day in the small ways that mattered more than any grand gesture. He had chosen her when his mother suggested a larger apartment in a more suitable neighborhood, and he said they were happy where they were. He had chosen her when his father offered him a position at the Whitfield Group, and he turned it down to continue designing community spaces for a small firm whose work he believed in. He had chosen the life they were building together over the life that had been prepared for him, and he had done it without drama, without estrangement, without burning any bridge. He didn't have to burn. He was patient with his parents in the way of a man who loved them and did not expect them to be different than they were. Nora had tried to love the Whitfields for Elliot's sake. She had brought food to their home and asked Constance about her charitable work and listened to Harlan's opinions about architecture with genuine interest. Because she did have genuine interest, and because she believed that people were usually more than their worst instincts if you gave them enough time and space to show you. But there was always the undercurrent. Always the slight pause before Constance answered a question about Nora's teaching. Always the way Harlan's eyes moved over their modest apartment with an assessment he never quite voiced. Always the assumption humming beneath every conversation like a frequency just outside hearing range that this arrangement was temporary. That eventually Elliot would come to his senses and the gap between his world and hers would reassert itself in some practical way that everyone could acknowledge without anyone having to be blamed. The twins arrived 4 years into their marriage. Wren first 7 minutes before her brother arriving in the world with a cry that sounded almost indignant, as if she had been in the middle of something and resented the interruption. Cade followed with less drama and more apparent curiosity, looking around the delivery room with a focused expression of someone taking notes. Elliot had sat beside Nora's bed for 3 hours after holding both infants against his chest, one in each arm. Not sleeping, not wanting to miss a second. She had watched him from the pillow, exhausted and grateful, and more in love with him than she had known how to say. They had been happy. That was the thing Nora needed to hold on to now on this cracked concrete step with the ring between her fingers and the autumn light fading through the old trees. They had been genuinely, specifically happy in the way that had nothing to do with how much money was in the account or how large the house was or what anyone else thought of their choices. They had been happy in their small house near the school where Nora taught. Happy in the garden. Elliot put in the first summer they owned the place. Happy in the Friday night dinners where he cooked and she graded papers at the kitchen table and the twins did their homework on the living room floor while music played from the old speaker on the shelf. Their life had a texture to it, a realness that Nora had never taken for granted. She had known in some unspoken way that it was fragile, but she had not known how fragile. Elliot was 36 when he started losing weight. He attributed it to a busy season at the firm, a demanding project, not enough sleep. He was disciplined about everything else, exercise, diet, sleep when he could get it, and so the weight loss seemed like an anomaly rather than a signal. He went to the doctor in March because Nora asked him to. She had noticed something else beyond the weight equality to his skin, a subtle yellowish tinge that appeared first in the whites of his eyes and that he dismissed when she mentioned it. He called her from the parking lot of the diagnostic center on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the middle of a lesson about the Civil War, and she stepped out of the classroom when she saw his number, knowing in the way that love sometimes grants its most terrible knowledge that she did not want to hear what he was about to say in front of 27 14-year-olds. Pancreatic cancer, caught late as it almost always was. The next 14 months were a different kind of life, one that happened inside the first one, like a room discovered behind a bookshelf. There was the life they continued living on the surface, the children's school routines, Elliot's work, when he could manage it, dinners and grocery runs and homework on the living room floor. And there was the other life, the one organized around appointments and treatments, and the careful management of information for two 10-year-olds who were old enough to understand that something was wrong and young enough to still believe that the adults around them could fix it. Nora had not told the children the full truth for 2 months. She hated herself for that delay in one part of her mind and understood it completely in another. When she finally sat them down on the living room couch, the twins on either side of her with their feet not quite reaching the floor, she had used the word serious. She had said their father was very sick with a serious illness, and that the doctors were working hard to help him, and that no matter what happened, both she and Elliot loved them more than any words she had ever managed to find. Wren had climbed into her lap immediately, which surprised Nora because Wren was usually the one who needed time before she could accept comfort. Cade had sat very still for a long moment. Then he had said, "Is Dad scared?" "Sometimes." Nora told him honestly. "I'm going to not be scared," Cade said, "so he doesn't have to be scared too." Elliot had cried when she told him what Cade said. It was one of the few times she had seen him cry. He was not a man who withheld emotion as a matter of pride, but he had learned during those 14 months to hold himself steady for the children in a way that cost him something, and he paid that cost without complaint because that was the kind of father he was. The Whitfields inserted themselves into the crisis with the confidence of people accustomed to having the resources to solve problems. They wanted Elliot to come home to their estate in Greenwich where he could have private nursing care and every comfort money could arrange. They wanted the twins in private school immediately somewhere more appropriate given the circumstances. They suggested that Nora might benefit from stepping back from her teaching position, that managing Elliot's care was a full-time responsibility, and that they could certainly supplement whatever was needed financially. What they meant beneath all of it was that they wanted to take over, to insert their weight and their resources between Nora and the choices she was making, and to gradually, gracefully, with the best possible intentions, replace her judgment with their own. Elliot said no to all of it, quietly, firmly, without anger, in the way that he did everything that mattered. He told his parents that he and Nora were managing their lives and that he needed them to trust that. He said it once. He did not say it again. His parents complied in the way of people who are biding their time. In the final months, when it became clear that the treatments were buying time rather than solving the problem, Elliot's behavior shifted in ways that Nora noticed but did not fully understand until much later. He spent long evenings in his study with the door closed, which was new. He made phone calls that he did not mention afterward. He went through their financial files with a thoroughness that seemed excessive for a man who handled their finances with such consistent care. When she asked him what he was working on, he said he was getting things in order, and she let it go because she was exhausted and grieving already. Grieving the future they had planned, and she did not have the emotional bandwidth to press. He wrote her a letter that she found in the recipe box. Not then, later. But in those final months, she watched him write it sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. His handwriting slower than it used to be, but still recognizable. Still the careful, deliberate script of a man who took words seriously. When she asked what he was writing, he looked up at her with an expression she could only describe later as complete, like a man who had made peace with the thing he was carrying and wanted her to know it. "Something for you to find when you need it," he said. She had not pressed. The last weeks contracted into a series of images that Nora had organized in her memory, less like a timeline and more like a collection of photographs. Each one weighted, each one still, each one more precious for the knowledge of what came after. Elliot sitting with Wren in the backyard, watching her sketch, saying nothing, just being there with her in the October light. Elliot and Kate at the kitchen table with a model airplane. Cade's tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, Elliot's hand guiding his son's, without taking over the patience of a man who understood that the point was never the finish plane. Elliot holding Nora's hand in the hospital room on a Tuesday evening, the room quiet, the machines counting their steady numbers, and him saying so simply, so quietly, that he was grateful. That he had gotten to have exactly the life he wanted, that he needed her to know she was the best decision he had ever made. He died on a Wednesday, November. The leaves were almost gone. The funeral was held at the Whitfield Family Church, a large stone building in Greenwich that had a pipe organ and stained glass and seating for 400. Constance had organized everything with the efficiency of a woman who needed to be doing something and who did things at a particular scale. There were flower arrangements from a florist in Manhattan and a reception catered by people who arrived in white trucks. There were 400 people in attendance, many of whom had not seen Elliot in years, and some of whom Nora had never met. She sat in the front pew with Wren on her left and Kate on her right. The children were quiet in the way of people conserving themselves for something they don't yet know how to face. Constance sat on the other side of Cade, composed appropriate a woman in control of her grief, because control was what she understood. Harlan sat beside Constance, his jaw set, his eyes forward. A minister spoke about Elliot's professional achievements. A colleague spoke about his work designing affordable housing projects in underfunded municipalities. An old friend from his college years told a story about a camping trip that made people laugh softly. Nora sat through all of it, feeling like someone watching a documentary about a person she had known better than anyone in that room, and who had nevertheless been assembled into a version of himself she did not quite recognize. The Elliot in those eulogies was accomplished and admired and gone. The Elliot she was grieving was the man who made eggs on Sunday mornings and got genuinely angry at bad architecture and pressed his knee against hers across dinner tables when she needed to know he was there. She gripped the ring. It was already on her finger then. It would stay there. After the funeral, the Whitfields became a constant presence. They arrived at the house with food and suggestions, in the quiet assumption that proximity was the same as help. Constance came 3 times in the first week, always with something: a casserole, a name for a grief counselor, an opinion about the children's school schedule delivered as concern. Harlan came less often but carried more weight when he did, sitting in the kitchen with the authority of a man who believed he was owed a certain deference. They talked about the children's future with a specificity that unsettled Nora. Private schools were mentioned, summer programs, the estate in Greenwich with its guest quarters and its space and its distance from the public school on Maynard Street, where Wren and Cade had classmates who knew them and teachers who cared about them. The Whitfields spoke of all of this as if it were already decided, as if grief had dissolved the boundaries between their judgment and hers, as if Elliot's death had opened a door that his life had kept shut. Nora pushed back, gently at first, then less gently. "The children need to stay in their school," she said during one of those kitchen conversations, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had been Elliot's that she was not ready to put away. "They need their routines. They need everything familiar that we can manage to keep familiar." "Change can also be healthy," Constance said with the tone of a woman who considered all opposition to her ideas a form of naivety. "Not this kind of change. Not right now." The conversation ended the way those conversations always ended, with Constance withdrawing into a polite silence that was not the same as agreement, and that everyone in the room understood as a pause rather than a concession. That night, after the twins were asleep, Nora sat in Elliot's study. She had not spent much time in there since he died. It still smelled like him, faintly the cedar from his bookshelves, and something else beneath it, something warmer that she could not name but recognize completely. She sat at his desk and put her hands flat on the surface and stayed there for a long time. She opened the recipe box because she did not know what else to do, and because she had sometimes come to it for comfort during the months of his illness. Elliot had started keeping recipes there as a kind of joke when they were first married, insisting that a well-organized life included a well-organized kitchen, and the box had gradually filled with index cards in his handwriting and occasional notes in hers. and once a drawing Wren had done of a birthday cake that they had kept because it was perfect. She went through the cards slowly. His handwriting on each one was steady, careful, annotated in the margins with small modifications and occasional ratings. She did not know what she was looking for. She found it near the back, tucked behind a divider marked desserts. A small envelope, cream-colored. On the front, in Elliot's handwriting, her name. Inside was a single index card. She read it 3 times, then set it on the desk and looked at it from a short distance, as if proximity was making it harder to take in rather than easier. The words were simple. They did not explain the arrangements he had made, or the accounts he had set up, or the conversations he had had with lawyers and neighbors, and anyone else who was part of whatever plan he had built in those final months behind the closed door of his study. The words said only, "Find Conrad Ashby." The number was there, and beneath it, in the same handwriting and letters she could see, had been pressed with particular intention, "You are enough, exactly as you are. You have always been enough." She did not call the number that night. She put the card back in the envelope and the envelope back behind the desserts divider, and closed the recipe box and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the house, which was still learning to be quiet without him. The moving truck came on a gray Saturday morning 6 weeks after the funeral. Nora was making breakfast when she heard it. Wren heard it first, actually. Her daughter appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in pajamas, the stuffed owl Elliot had given her for her 8th birthday, clutched against her chest and said, "Mom, there's a big truck outside." Through the kitchen window, Nora could see the truck and 2 men in gray uniforms who were sitting in the cab waiting. She could see Constance Whitfield on the front lawn in a wool coat holding a folder. Her expression, the kind of compose that takes considerable effort to maintain. She went to the door. She opened it. Constance held out the folder. She did it with the gesture of a woman performing an action. She had rehearsed something she was doing because it needed to be done, rather than because it gave her any satisfaction. Nora would believe that later. She would believe that Constance had constructed this as a practical matter, a necessary clarification of circumstances that had always been what they were, and that the emotion of it had been filed somewhere else. Somewhere she could manage it without it getting in the way of what needed to happen. "I think you should read this," Constance said. Nora took the folder. She read the first page. Then she read the second page. Her hands did not shake. She was proud of that later. Her hands were completely still. The house had never been theirs. It was held by the Whitfield Family Trust, a legal entity established decades before Elliot was born, and it had been made available to Elliot and his family as a matter of family arrangement rather than ownership. That arrangement had been tied to Elliot's life. With his death, the arrangement concluded. The document was precise and thorough, and there was not a sentence in it that was open to negotiation. An attorney had signed it. A notary had signed it. The language was impeccable. "How long have you known?" Nora asked. "Elliot always knew," Constance said. "The arrangement was his to explain to you as he saw fit." Wren had appeared behind Nora's legs without Nora noticing. She could feel her daughter's presence, the small weight of her against the back of her knees. "The children will be much more comfortable at the estate," Constance said. Her voice had shifted, slightly softened in the direction of her grandchildren. She was not cruel about this. Nora needed to acknowledge that. She was not a woman who enjoyed this moment, but she was a woman who had decided it was necessary. "They have rooms prepared for them, schools arranged, everything they need." "And me," Nora said. Constance's expression moved through something complicated. "You'll need time to make your own arrangements. Harlan and I can offer some support during the transition, of course. We're not trying to be unreasonable." "Just thorough," Nora said. Constance met her eyes then. There was something in her expression that Nora would think about later in quieter moments, something that was not triumph and not indifference and not quite grief, but that contained elements of all three. She said, "Elliot loved you. No one is disputing that. But love doesn't determine these things. The house has to go back to the trust. That's simply what it is." Nora said nothing. Constance said, "You have until tomorrow evening. The movers can take your personal belongings now." Harlan was in the driveway near the moving truck. He was looking at the house with the expression of a man who was doing what needed to be done and had decided that efficiency was a form of compassion. He met Nora's eyes once briefly and looked away. She took the children upstairs. She helped them pack what they could pack. Wren brought her sketchbooks and her pencils and the stuffed owl. Cade moved through the house with systematic focus, counting their things, making lists in a small notebook. He had found somewhere his face set with the expression of someone who has decided that management is the available form of control. "Are we going to live at Grandma's house?" Wren asked. "No," Nora said. "We're going to find our own place." "But where?" Kate asked. She did not have an answer. She was standing in the kitchen, the recipe box in her hands, trying to think clearly through the sound of the movers on the stairs, when a knock came at the back door. She opened it. He was a large man, probably in his early 70s, with the kind of build that spoke to decades of physical work. His hands were thick and calloused, his face weathered in the way of people who spend time outdoors without vanity about it. He was wearing a canvas jacket and boots that had seen considerable use. He was holding a key on a simple metal ring. He said his name was Walter Briggs. He said he had a place on Elm Street that needed a good tenant, someone who could appreciate what a house could be when you put some care into it. He said the rent was modest because the house needed work, and he had been waiting for the right person. He held out the key. Nora looked at him. "Why are you here?" she said. "How do you know me?" He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I knew your husband," he said. She waited. He did not say anything else. He just held out the key. She took it. They loaded the car with what they could carry. The movers took the larger furniture on behalf of the trust, which meant it was going into storage somewhere, which meant she might see it again or might not. She did not have energy for that calculation right now. She had her children, and she had the car, and she had the recipe box, and she had the ring on her finger and the key Walter Briggs had given her, and the card inside the recipe box that said to find Conrad Ashby and said she was enough. Cade sat in the back seat with the notebook in his lap, still writing his lists. Wren pressed her face against the window as they pulled out of the driveway, watching the house until they turned the corner, and it was gone. The house on Elm Street appeared before them like a question the neighborhood had been saving. The paint was peeling in long, deliberate strips from the wood siding. The front steps sagged on one side where the support had settled unevenly. Two of the windows on the upper floor were covered with plywood. The yard was a geology of neglect, overgrown and matted with the debris of several seasons. Walter Briggs was already there, parked at the curb in a truck that was older than some marriages Nora knew. He got out when they pulled up and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the house with the expression of someone who saw it differently than they did, who saw what it could be rather than what it currently was. "It needs work," Nora said, standing on the sidewalk with Wren beside her and Cade already moving toward the front door, already assessing. "Yes," Walter said. He did not apologize for this. "Good bones," she said. He almost smiled. "Excellent bones. Built in 1934. They knew how to build in 1934. Inside the house smelled of dust and closed rooms and time. The floors were hard wood under the grime-wide planks that would be beautiful when they were cleaned. The ceilings were high. The rooms were larger than she had expected. Light came through the windows that weren't covered, falling in long rectangles across the floor. Wren walked through the rooms slowly, her owl under her arm, her footsteps careful on the old floors, like a person moving through a place that wasn't sure yet whether they were welcome. Cade went directly to the kitchen, opened every cabinet, checked the water pressure at the sink, and came back to report that it was functional. "It just needs love," Nora said to herself as much as to anyone. Walter had brought a thermos of coffee and three of something else he'd stopped for on the way. Small packages of crackers and cheese, practical and without ceremony. They sat on the floor of the empty living room in the October light and ate, and did not talk much. Wren leaned against Nora's side. Cade sat cross-legged with his notebook, still making his lists. After a while, Wren said quietly, "Is Dad going to be able to find us here?" The room was very still. Nora pulled her daughter close. She thought about the card in the recipe box. She thought about the letter she was not ready to read yet, the one Elliot had been writing at the kitchen table in those final weeks. She thought about Walter Briggs, who had known her husband, who had appeared with a key at the exact moment she needed one, who sat with them now on the floor of this empty house, drinking coffee and not requiring anything from any of them. "Yes," she said, "I think he already knows we're here." Outside the old oaks on Elm Street stood their ground against the wind that had been finding its way through this neighborhood for nearly a century, bending without breaking, deep-rooted and permanent, the way the things that matter most tend to be. Nora turned the ring. They were home. The first thing Nora fixed was the front steps. She did it on a Sunday morning in late October, 3 weeks after they moved in, while the twins were still asleep and the street outside was quiet enough that she could hear the birds working through the oak trees. She had watched a video on her phone twice the night before, sitting on the floor of the kitchen after the children were in bed, learning the vocabulary of the things she needed to do. Ledger boards, sister joists, the angle at which a nail should enter wood if you wanted it to hold through seasons and weight and time. Walter Briggs had left a collection of tools in the garage when he handed over the key. He had not made a production of it, had not presented them or inventoried them or explained what he was leaving. She had discovered them herself, arranged on a pegboard with a cleanliness and order that suggested a man who had spent decades knowing exactly where every tool was and why. She selected what she needed. She went to work. The steps took her 4 hours. Her hands were not trained for this, and the first two boards she pulled free required more effort than she had anticipated, and her shoulders ached by mid-morning. But there was something in the physical work that occupied the part of her mind that had been running in circles since November, the part that rehearsed unanswerable questions at 3 in the morning and cataloged everything she should have said and done differently, and turned grief over and over like a stone that never got any smoother. When she was working with her hands, that part went quiet. Not gone, quiet, which was enough. Kate appeared at the front door at 9:15, assessed the situation with his steady 10-year-old eyes and said, "Can I help? Hand me that level when I ask for it," she said. He sat on the porch in his pajamas and held the level and passed her nails from the box and watched everything she did with the focused attention he brought to all things that involve systems and precision. He did not ask unnecessary questions. When she made a mistake and had to pull a board and start again, he did not comment on it. When she finally stood back and tested the finished steps, pressing her weight onto each one, finding them solid and even and real, he stood up beside her and tested them too. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood there on the repaired steps in the cool October air, and Nora felt something she had not felt in a long time, something small and specific and hers. Not happiness, not yet, but competence. The deep bodily knowledge that she had done a thing that needed doing and had done it well. The weeks that followed organized themselves around work and children in the house, which gave Nora a structure she was grateful for, because structure was the only thing keeping the grief from becoming total. She had arranged 3 jobs before the month was out. Mornings she substitute taught at Jefferson Middle School, filling in wherever she was needed, but spending most of her time in the history and social studies classrooms where she felt most herself. Afternoons she worked at a copy and print shop 3 blocks from the school, a job she had found through a notice on a bulletin board, and that paid $12 an hour and required nothing of her emotionally, which was sometimes exactly what she needed. 2 evenings a week, she tutored high school students in their parents' homes across town, sitting at kitchen islands in houses that reminded her of the Whitfield dining room, helping teenagers parse the causes of wars and the mechanics of constitutional amendments, while their parents moved through rooms in the background, unhurried at ease in the way of people whose lives had not recently come apart. She was tired in a way she had never been tired before, a structural exhaustion that went below the muscle and bone to something deeper, some reserve she had not known she was drawing on. But she was not broken. She needed to know that. She tested it daily the way she had tested the repaired steps, pressing her weight onto it and finding it hold. Ren was the one she worried about most. Her daughter had always processed the world through image before language, always needed to draw or paint the shape of something before she could speak about it. And the months since Elliot's death had filled her sketchbooks with landscapes Nora could barely look at directly. Storms drawn with such physical force that the charcoal smeared across the facing page. Houses with their foundations crumbling. The walls leaning at angles that made the buildings look like they were trying to fall towards something, rather than simply falling apart. Figures standing alone in wide empty spaces, small against the weather. Nora kept the sketchbooks. She did not remove them or suggest other subjects. She understood enough about her daughter to know that the darkness in the drawings was not a symptom to be corrected, but a truth being expressed, and that expression was better than silence. But some mornings she would find Wren standing at the window of her bedroom, looking out at the street with an expression no 10-year-old should have to wear, and Nora would stand in the doorway and simply say her name. And Wren would turn around and something in her face would shift like a key turning like a door opening just enough to let in a little light. Cade carried his worry differently. He had appointed himself the family's logistics officer, tracking their supplies with the seriousness of a man responsible for a small expedition. He knew exactly how much milk was in the refrigerator and how many days until Nora got paid and whether there was enough bread. He swept without being asked and carried the laundry down from upstairs and fixed things around the house with a determination that was touching and heartbreaking in equal measure. One afternoon, Nora came home from the copy shop to find him in the kitchen standing on a chair to reach the leaking faucet, a wrench from Walter's garage in his hand, his face set with the expression of someone who has decided that competence is what the situation requires and that he has competence to offer. She did not tell him to stop. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him work. When he finished and turned the water back on, and the drip did not return, he looked at her with something in his eyes that was partly pride and partly a question, a checking in that children did when they needed to know the world was still legible. "Good work," she said. "Dad showed me," he said. "Last winter, he said every man should know how to fix a leaky faucet." She crossed the kitchen and hugged him from behind, and he let her, which he was increasingly less inclined to do in the general run of things, because he was 10 and dignity had become important to him. She pressed her face into the top of his head and felt the steady, alive warmth of him, and was grateful in a way that was almost painful. Walter Briggs came by on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He came with purpose, always arriving with something specific to address the furnace filter, the bathroom caulk, the section of fence along the back of the yard that had rotted through at the base. He showed up, fixed what needed fixing, and left. No performance of concern, no questions that required a particular kind of answer. His presence was useful and consistent and utterly without demand, which was exactly the kind of presence Nora needed from another adult in those early months. He and Cade had developed a working relationship of few words and considerable mutual respect. When Walter came, Cade was always nearby within minutes, watching, learning, occasionally being handed a tool and shown something specific. Walter taught the way Elliot had taught, by doing the thing correctly and letting the observation be the lesson without making a production of the pedagogy. Nora watched this sometimes from the kitchen window, the big old man and her small son moving around the yard together, and felt something that she did not have a name for, but that felt very close to gratitude. She did not ask Walter how he had known Elliot. She wanted to, but she did not. There was something about the way he had said it simply without elaboration that suggested it was a thing he would tell her when the time was right and not before. The phone calls started in the fourth week. She noticed the number first because it was the same number every time a Connecticut exchange she did not recognize, and because it called at 7 in the evening, which was a considerate hour, a chosen hour, not the hour of telemarketers. She let it go to voicemail the first time. The message was brief. A man identified himself as Conrad Ashby and said he represented the interests of a trust established by Elliot Calloway and that he needed to speak with Nora at her earliest convenience. His voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering information that required careful reception. She did not call back. She told herself it was because she was tired. She told herself it was because she had enough to manage. She told herself it was because every legal or financial development in her life over the past several months had been something taken from her rather than given, and she did not have the reserves to absorb another blow, even a well-intentioned one. The calls continued. Same number, same evening hour, same brief patient voicemail. Conrad Ashby, the trust. Whenever she was ready, she began to dread 7 o'clock. Wren noticed. Children noticed everything when the adults around them were trying not to let anything show. Who keeps calling? Wren asked one evening, appearing in the kitchen doorway while Nora stood looking at the phone screen. A lawyer, Nora said. What kind of lawyer? The kind with information I'm not sure I'm ready for. Wren considered this with the seriousness she brought to all complex things. Dad said that the hardest truths are usually the ones you needed the longest, she said. Nora looked at her daughter. When did he say that? When I asked him why he waited to tell us he was sick. Wren looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. He said he was trying to find the right way, but he also said waiting too long was its own kind of harm. Nora stood with that for the rest of the evening. On the 7th week, she answered. Mr. Ashby, she said. Mrs. Calloway. A pause, brief and respectful. Thank you for picking up. I know this has been a difficult period to navigate, and I've tried to be patient about the timing. What is this about? She was standing in the kitchen, her back to the window, the recipe box on the counter in her line of sight. Your husband established a private foundation approximately 2 years before his death. Conrad Ashby said, it is called the Meridian Foundation, and it is funded by a trust originally established by his maternal grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, who passed away 4 years ago. The trust is worth approximately $200 million. Your husband was the sole trustee during his lifetime. With his death, trusteeship passes to you. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Nora said. Can you say the number again? He said it again. She sat down on the kitchen floor, not because she intended to, because her legs simply offered her less than she needed from them in that moment. She sat on the floor with her back against the cabinet below the sink and held the phone against her ear and looked at the recipe box on the counter above her and thought about the index card she had memorized. The one that said, find this man. The one that said she was enough. He had known the whole time. She excluded the Whitfield family. Conrad Ashby continued, his voice steady and patient, clearly understanding that she needed the information in portions she could absorb. Eleanor Whitfield established the trust specifically for your husband, in part because she felt strongly that her daughter Constance and son-in-law Harlan had developed a relationship with money that she considered incompatible with the values she had tried to raise her family around. She wanted your husband to have resources that were his without condition or obligation to his parents. He honored that intention by keeping the trust private. For how long, Nora said. Her voice sounded strange to her, distant. How long did he know about this? He inherited trusteeship from his grandmother 4 years ago, Conrad Ashby said. He has been managing the foundation quietly since then. 4 years. The twins had been 6. They had been living in their small house near the school where she taught budgeting, carefully choosing the good life over the expensive one. And Elliot had known about $200 million and had not told her, and had kept on clipping grocery coupons with her on Sunday mornings, and had kept on choosing the less expensive wine, and had kept on living exactly the life they had chosen together with full knowledge that he could have chosen differently. Why didn't he tell me, she said. It came out more raw than she intended. Conrad Ashby was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man with no answer, but the quiet of a man choosing his words with genuine care. He left a letter addressing that. He said, I can read it to you or mail it to you, or we can meet in person and you can read it yourself. Whatever feels right. But the short version from my conversations with him during the planning process was that he needed to know something. He needed to know that you were with him for the life he had chosen, not the life he could have bought. And he needed your children to have the chance to learn what he had spent years learning himself. That comfort isn't the same as worth. That having enough to live on and choosing to live decently is not poverty. It's principle. Nora was crying. She had not known she had started. She cried quietly the way she had taught herself to cry during Elliot's illness. Not the kind that took over and consumed everything, but the kind that moved through you and kept moving grief as weather rather than flood. She sat on the kitchen floor and let it move through her and looked at the recipe box and thought about the man who had written her name on a cream-colored envelope and tucked it behind the desserts divider where he had known, with the precise knowledge of a man who understood his wife completely, that she would eventually find it. "Mrs. Calloway," Conrad Ashby said, "are you all right?" "I'm furious," she said. "That seems entirely reasonable." "I'm furious at him for not telling me, and I'm furious at myself for being furious at a dead man." She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. "And I'm grateful, which makes the fury worse somehow." "Yes," he said simply, "I imagine it does." She did not tell the children that night. She sat with Ren and Cade through dinner and helped Cade with a math worksheet and sat beside Ren while she worked on a new drawing, this one lighter than the recent ones. A house with smoke coming from the chimney and a tree in the yard beginning to show new leaves. And she held all of it inside her like a thing she was not yet ready to set down. She went to see Walter Briggs on Saturday morning. She had never gone to him. He had always come to her. She found his address in the simple way of neighbors by asking a woman on the next block who looked as though she had lived there long enough to know everyone. His house was 3 streets over a modest craftsman bungalow that he kept with the same precise attention he brought to everything. Clean gutters painted trim, a garden along the front that was put to bed for winter but showed the evidence of serious seasonal care. He answered the door with a mug of coffee in his hand and looked at her for a moment with eyes that seemed to have anticipated this visit. "Come in," he said. His kitchen was the kitchen of a man who cooked seriously and alone with good equipment that was worn from use and not for display. He poured her coffee without asking whether she wanted it and set it in front of her and sat down across the table and waited. "You need to tell me," she said. He looked at his coffee, then at her. He had the face of a man who had spent decades earning the right to take things at whatever pace they required, and she could see him deciding now that the pace this required was directness. "I met Elliot 6 months before he died," he said. "He came to find me. I hadn't met him before that. He found me because I owned several rental properties in this area, and he wanted the house on Elm Street specifically. He said he had done his research and he thought it was the right place, the right neighborhood. He asked me to hold it for his family." Nora sat with that. "He paid the first year's rent in advance," Walter continued. "Not from a joint account, from the foundation." He looked at her steadily. "He asked me to be around when it was needed, not to take over, just to be around. He said his wife was more capable than she knew and that his children needed to see her be capable, but that everyone needed a neighbor who showed up." Nora stared at the surface of her coffee. "He told you to leave the tools," she said. "Yes. He planned the whole thing." "He was a thorough man," Walter said. There was something in his voice that was not quite grief, but that lived in the same neighborhood. "He talked about you and the children for most of 3 hours the first time we met. He wasn't asking me to take care of you. He was making sure you'd have what you needed to take care of yourselves. There's a difference." She thought about Cade at the leaky faucet. She thought about the tools on the pegboard precisely arranged. She thought about Walter appearing at the back door with a key on the day the world fell apart, the right person in the right place, because Elliot had sent him there 6 months before with the quiet foresight of a man arranging the things that love required of him. "Was there more?" she said. Walter set his mug down. "The art supplies in the purple box," he said. "In the garage behind the folded tarps. A wooden case with your daughter's name on a brass plate. He ordered it through the foundation and asked me to make sure it got to the house before you arrived. The scholarship application for your son's math competition program, the one that covers the registration fees and the travel costs. That went through the foundation too. And the arrangement with the school district that ensures substitute teachers in this zone get priority placement." He paused. "He wanted to make sure you had work you'd be good at in a place close enough that you could be home when they needed you." Nora thought about the morning she had found the purple wooden case in the garage and brought it to Ren and watched her daughter's face open like a window in spring, the way she had held the brushes with both hands reverently, like things from a world she had been afraid she no longer had access to. She thought about Cade receiving the letter about the math program and reading it twice and then a third time with the focus of someone who cannot quite believe what the words are saying. She had thought those were coincidences. She had thought of them as the small mercies that sometimes accompanied disaster, the world occasionally being kinder than it had any obligation to be. They had been Elliot. He had been taking care of them from 6 months before he died, through channels they could not see through a foundation they did not know existed, and he had done it in such a way that they had to do the work themselves and feel the satisfaction of doing it, and build the knowledge of their own capabilities from the ground up without the cushion of wealth softening the lesson he needed them to learn. She stayed until the coffee was cold. Walter did not rush her. When she finally stood to leave, he said, "He was a good man." "Yes," she said, "he was." She was at the door when he said quietly, "He also said you were the best person he'd ever known. He wanted me to know that, in case you forgot." She nodded. She could not speak. She walked home through the November morning through the streets that were becoming familiar to her. Now the particular cracks in the sidewalk at the corner of Elm and Fourth, the house 3 doors down with the yellow door that she had begun to think of as a landmark. The oak trees that were bare now, but that she had started to be able to picture in leaf, to see the street they would make in spring, to believe in the version of this neighborhood that existed in the better season. She told the children about the foundation that evening after dinner, when they were all three on the couch in the living room with the lamp on and the rest of the house in comfortable dimness. She did not tell them the full number. They were 10. The full number could wait for a time when they had more of the architecture to understand it. She told them that their father had set up a foundation to help people, and that he had arranged some things to help their family too, and that they were going to be all right in ways she was still working out. Ren said immediately, "I knew it." Cade said, "The art supplies." "Yes," Nora said. Cade was quiet for a moment, adding things up in his head in the way he always did. Then he said, "The math program too." Yes. His jaw worked. He was not going to cry. She could see that he had made some decision about crying that she was not going to challenge tonight. He looked at the lamp for a moment, then at her. "He was still taking care of us." "He never stopped," she said. Ren climbed into her lap. She was getting too big for this, but Nora folded her in anyway, all the angles and weight of her, and held her. And Cade leaned against Nora's side, without being asked. His small shoulder pressed to hers, and the three of them sat together in the lamplight in the house on Elm Street and let themselves be held for a few minutes by the evidence of a love that had been larger and more deliberate and more enduring than any of them had fully understood. After a while, Cade spoke into the silence. "Are we going to use it," he said, "the money, to get a better house?" Nora looked around the room. At the walls she had scrubbed clean, at the lamp casting its warm circle across the floor, at the kitchen doorway through which she could see the recipe box on the counter exactly where it had always been, exactly where she needed it to be. "Not right now," she said. "Your dad chose this house. He chose this neighborhood and this school and this street for a reason. I don't think we should be in a hurry to leave before we've understood what that reason was." Cade considered this with the seriousness he brought to all problems worth solving. Then he nodded once, the way a person nods when they have heard something that confirms a conclusion they were already reaching. Ren said nothing. She simply reached for her sketchbook from the end table and opened it to a fresh page. And she began to draw there in the lamplight while Nora held her the first lines of something that was not a storm and not a falling house, but something she could not yet see the shape of, something that was beginning. 3 days later, Constance Whitfield called. The number came up on Nora's phone on a Wednesday afternoon between the copy shop and the evening tutoring session while she was standing outside the school waiting for the twins. She looked at it for 2 rings. She answered. "Nora." Constance's voice was warm in a way it had not been before. Specifically, carefully warm, the warmth of a woman who had recently recalculated a situation. "I've been thinking about you and the children. I hope you're all settling in." "We're well, thank you," Nora said. "I'd love to have you all over for dinner soon. It's been too long since we've seen the children properly, and Harlan and I feel strongly that families should stay connected regardless of circumstances." Of course, Nora said. And I wanted to say that if there's anything we can do to help with your situation, practically speaking, we're very open to a conversation. Things look different when we have time to step back from the grief. Nora stood on the sidewalk outside Jefferson Middle School and watched the door for her children and understood exactly what had happened. The Whitfields had access to resources and connections and information that moved in the circles they occupied, and word of a $200 million trust with the Callaway name on it had moved. Constance was not calling because grief had given her perspective. She was calling because the calculus had changed. "Thank you, Constance," Nora said. "I'll be in touch." She hung up. The dinner invitation did not come again. What came instead 8 days later was a certified envelope. She signed for it on a Thursday morning before school, and she stood in the doorway of the house on Elm Street and read it with the careful attention she had learned to bring to legal documents since November. The attention that did not flinch from the language or hope that a sentence meant something other than what it said. The Whitfields were petitioning the family court for primary custody of Ren and Kate Callaway on the grounds that their mother's financial circumstances represented an unstable environment for minor children. The petition cited Nora's multiple part-time employment positions as evidence of economic precarity. It cited the house on Elm Street with its condition and its neighborhood as an unsuitable primary residence. It cited what it called Nora's emotional fragility in the aftermath of her husband's death as a concern for the children's psychological well-being. The language was precise and thorough, and she recognized in it the same qualities she had recognized in the document about the house, the work of lawyers who had been given time and resources and a clear objective and had done their job without sentimentality. She put the envelope on the kitchen table. She made coffee. She sat with the coffee until it was cold, which took approximately the same amount of time as it took her to understand that she was not surprised. She had known this was the direction they were moving since the morning with the moving truck, perhaps before that, perhaps from the first kitchen conversation when Constance had said the children would be more comfortable at the estate and had meant something more than comfort. She had been waiting for the shape of the thing to clarify, and now it had. She was angry. She registered the anger carefully, the way she registered all things that could either help or hurt depending on how she managed them. She was angry in the way of a woman who has been underestimated repeatedly by people who should have known better, and who has discovered that their underestimation has not diminished her, but has simply revealed the gap between their model of her and the reality. She called Conrad Ashby. He picked up on the second ring. "I received a petition from the Whitfields," she said, "for custody." "I know," he said. "I was notified yesterday. I've been expecting your call." A pause. "Nora, I need to tell you something. Elliot anticipated this possibility. In the legal documents he established for the foundation, he included provisions for exactly this kind of situation. There is a file, prepared, with his instructions about how to respond." She looked at the ceiling of her kitchen. She thought about the man who had sat in his study with the door closed in those final months, making phone calls, writing letters, building architecture for a future he would not inhabit, but that he intended to hold up under pressure. "He thought of this," she said. It was not quite a question. "He thought of everything," Conrad Ashby said. "The question is what you want to do." She looked around the kitchen, at the repaired faucet, at the recipe box, at the window above the sink through which she could see the backyard where she had planted a small garden in October late in the season. Nothing elaborate, a few things that might survive the winter and come back in spring. She thought about the choice that had been sitting in front of her since the moment she read the number Conrad Ashby had given her. The money was there. It had always been there, planted like the garden waiting. She could take it and move somewhere beyond the Whitfields' reach, somewhere with better schools and cleaner walls and less strip paint on the window frames, somewhere that would give the Whitfields no surface to scratch with their legal instruments. But that was not what Elliot had built the foundation for. That was not what he had spent 6 months of his dying planning. He had not arranged the house on Elm Street, and the tools in the garage, and Walter Briggs on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so that Nora could take the first available exit from the life that was asking something real of her. He had done it so she would know when the real test came that she was already equal to it. "I want to fight," she said. Conrad Ashby did not say good. He did not say, "I thought you'd say that." He said, "Tell me when you can meet." And she told him, and they made the appointment. And when she hung up, she sat for one more moment at the kitchen table with the petition and the cold coffee and the recipe box and the quiet of a house that was becoming slowly and against considerable difficulty a home. Then she got up. She had children to collect from school. She had a tutoring session at 7. She had a garden to tend that was going to come back in spring, whether the Whitfields thought it would or not. She picked up her bag. She put the petition in it. She walked out of the house and down the repaired front steps, testing their solidity without thinking about it anymore. The way you stop testing the ground beneath your feet once you trust it to hold. The November light was thin and cold and entirely real, falling through the bare oaks onto the sidewalk in the pale, specific way of light that makes no promises about warmth, but shows up anyway every morning without being asked. She walked toward her children. Conrad Ashby's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Hartford that had been designed by someone who believed that glass and light were a form of honesty. Nora sat across from him at a table that held 2 legal pads, a thick accordion file, and a ceramic mug of coffee he had poured, without asking which she had already decided she liked about him. He was younger than his voice had suggested, somewhere in his early 40s, with a kind of precise, unhurried manner that came not from coldness, but from years of learning that careful people made fewer catastrophic mistakes than urgent ones. He opened the accordion file and placed a folder on the table between them. "Elliot came to me 3 months before he died," he said. "He had already been working with me on the foundation structure for 2 years, but this visit was different. He had a specific set of concerns he wanted to address." Conrad opened the folder. He was concerned that his parents would seek custody of the children following his death. He didn't know it would happen, but he thought it was likely enough that he wanted to be prepared. Nora looked at the folder. It was thick and tabbed, organized with the thoroughness of a man who had understood that the document he was building might have to stand without him. "What's in it?" she said. "Everything," Conrad said simply. 18 months of school records for both children showing consistent academic progress and positive behavioral assessments. 2 independent psychological evaluations of Ren and Cade conducted 6 months before Elliot's death, with updated assessments from their current school counselor. A financial accounting of the foundation's support structures that demonstrates the children's material needs have been continuously and reliably met, not through instability, but through deliberate planning. Character testimony from 4 of your colleagues at Jefferson, 3 of your tutoring clients, and your daughter's art teacher. He paused. And a letter, in Elliot's handwriting, addressed to the court. She stared at the folder. "He wrote a letter to a court he knew might never convene," she said. "He wrote a letter to a court he thought his wife might need," Conrad said. "There's a difference." She reached out and touched the edge of the folder without opening it. The paper was slightly cool under her fingertips. She thought about Elliot at his desk in those final months. The closed door, the phone calls she had not asked about, the deliberate, loving architecture of a man building the strongest structure he could for people he was going to have to leave in it. "He was angrier than you might expect in the letter," Conrad said, "about his parents' likely behavior. He was precise about it. He named the specific legal arguments they would probably use, and he addressed each one. He said he wanted it on record that he had chosen his wife and his children's life without coercion and without limitation, and with full understanding of the alternatives, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was not telling the truth about the man he had been." Nora pressed her fingers flat against the folder. "I want to read it," she said. "Take the whole file," he said. "Read everything. We meet with the court-appointed evaluator in 3 weeks, and the hearing is set for 6 weeks from Thursday. I want you to know every piece of this before we walk in." She took the file home. She read it over 3 evenings after the twins were asleep at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the recipe box on the counter, and the sound of the old house settling around her, the creaks and shifts of a building that had been through every kind of weather and was still standing. She read the school records and the psychological evaluations and the financial accountings. She read the statements from her colleagues, which were generous and specific and written by people who had been watching her navigate the last several months and had drawn their own conclusions about what kind of person she was. She read Elliot's letter last. It was 4 pages in his handwriting, which was steadier than she had expected, given when it was written the careful, deliberate script of a man who had decided that this document would not show the cost of writing it. He addressed the court formally, but without deference, as a man who respected process but was not intimidated by it. He described his marriage with a specificity that made her chest ache, not in the abstract language of affidavits, but in the concrete language of a man describing a life he had actually lived. He described Nora's character through incidents and observations and the accumulation of ordinary moments that added up in his account to a portrait of someone whose value to their children was not measurable by income or square footage or neighborhood demographics. And then near the end, he wrote something she had not expected. He wrote that he had kept the trust from her deliberately, not from distrust, but from love. He wrote that he had needed to know in the final chapters of his life that everything they had built together had been built on the right foundation, that she had chosen their life, not his money, that their children were being raised by someone who understood that character was not a luxury, but a necessity, and that you built it in the ordinary, difficult work of living rather than in the protection of wealth from consequences. He wrote that he had watched her in the months of his illness and had seen someone who was equal to anything, and that he needed the court to understand that removing these children from their mother's care would not be protecting them from hardship, but robbing them of their best teacher. She read the last paragraph twice. Then she put the letter back, smoothed the page flat with her palm, the way you press something you want to keep, and closed the folder and went to bed. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear, the kind of December morning that made the bare trees look like they had been drawn against the sky with careful intention. Nora dressed in the dark suit she had bought for Elliot's funeral and had not worn since, which felt appropriate in a way she did not examine too closely. She braided Wren's hair and made sure Cade's shirt was tucked and fed them both breakfast at the kitchen table, while explaining clearly and without dramatics what the day would involve. "We're going to a building where a judge will ask questions about our family," she said, "and then the judge will make a decision about where you live." Cade looked at her steadily. "We already know where we live," he said. "Yes," she said, "we do." Walter Briggs was at the courthouse when they arrived, standing near the entrance, in a good jacket she had not seen before, his large hands quiet at his sides, his face composed in the way of a man who had shown up to difficult things before and knew how to be present without making it about himself. He had agreed when she asked to serve as a character witness. He had said yes the way he said most things, simply without requiring her to persuade him. Nora left the children with a school counselor who had offered to bring them to the courthouse and stay with them during the proceedings. She did not want them in the room. This was her fight to have in the room. Their part came later. The Whitfields were already seated when she entered the hearing chamber. Constance wore charcoal gray and the composed expression of a woman who had prepared for this with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. Harlan sat beside her, his posture formal, his face arranged into something that might have been concern or might have been the careful performance of concern. Their attorneys were two men with a composed stillness that spoke of long experience and considerable hourly rates. Conrad Ashby sat beside Nora with the accordion file on the table and a legal pad on which he had written at the top in ordinary pencil a single word she could read from where she sat. "Ready." The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an attention she brought to everything as if she had learned long ago that the truth was usually not in the center of the room, but in the margins, the details people were not trying to control. Her name was Judge Meredith Oates, and she had been on the family court bench for 19 years. And it showed not in weariness, but in something sharper and more valuable: the ability to hear what was being said underneath the thing being said. The Whitfield's attorneys presented their case with the polished competence of professionals doing what they had been paid to do. They cited Nora's 3 part-time positions as evidence of financial instability. They presented photographs of the house on Elm Street taken from the street, angled to emphasize the remaining peeling paint, and the window frames she had not yet gotten to. They characterized the neighborhood as one with elevated crime statistics, which was technically accurate in a way that was also deliberately misleading, and they suggested that the children's adjustment challenges at Jefferson Middle School were evidence of a destabilizing home environment. Nora sat through it. She made herself hear every word. She did not look at the Whitfields. When it was Conrad's turn, he was unhurried and thorough. He entered the school records and the psychological evaluations into evidence. He entered the financial accounting of the foundation's support structures. He called the school counselor from Jefferson, who described both children's significant academic and social progress over the preceding months. He called Nora's department head at the substitute placement, who described her as one of the most requested substitutes in the district. He called the art teacher who ran the after-school program Wren attended, who spoke about her student with the invested language of a teacher who genuinely cares about a child's development and is not performing that investment for a courtroom. Then he called Walter Briggs. Walter took the stand the way he took up any space without apology and without excess. He looked at the Whitfield's attorney the way a man looks at weather, acknowledging it, not afraid of it. The attorney made an attempt to establish that Walter's relationship with the family was too limited to be meaningful. Walter answered the questions in the way of a man who understood that brevity was not the same as insufficiency. He said he had known Elliot Calloway personally. He said he had spent time with Nora and her children over the preceding months and had seen how she ran her household and raised her family. He said he had seen women manage considerably more difficult circumstances with considerably fewer resources, and that he had seen some of them fail and some of them not fail, and that what distinguished the ones who did not fail was a quality he would call groundedness, which was not the same as wealth and was not transferable by inheritance, and was not something you could acquire from a real estate catalog. He said he had watched Nora Calloway repair the front steps of her house with tools she had not used before, and that she had done it carefully and correctly, and that those steps were going to outlast the decade. He said that was not a metaphor, it was an observation, but if the court wanted to make a metaphor of it, he thought they probably could. Judge Oates looked at Walter over her reading glasses for a moment. Then she looked at her notes. Conrad entered Elliot's letter into evidence. He did not read it aloud. He submitted it and gave the judge time to read it, and the room was quiet while she did the only sound, the faint mechanical hum of the building and the occasional scratch of a pen. Nora watched the judge's face while she read. She saw the moment somewhere in the third page when something shifted in the judge's expression. Not dramatically, not in the way of theatrical reveals, but in the small, specific way of someone encountering something that has the quality of truth. The Whitfield's attorney objected to the letter's admissibility on several grounds. Judge Oates overruled all of them with a brevity that suggested she had considered each objection and found it insufficient and did not need to elaborate on why. Then it was Nora's turn. She had prepared with Conrad a careful and thorough presentation of the life she and her children were living. She had practiced it at the kitchen table after the twins were asleep, going through it in her head, making sure she could say all of it without breaking which she could, because she had learned in the past year to carry grief without being subsumed by it. But when she stood and faced the judge, what she said was simpler than anything she had prepared. She said that her husband had spent the last months of his life building a structure to protect their children, not from difficulty, but from the wrong kinds of difficulty. And that structure included the neighborhood they lived in, and the school they attended, and the neighbor who came on Tuesdays, and the art teacher who gave her daughter room to grow. She said that her children were not enduring their circumstances, but inhabiting them, which was a different thing entirely. She said that Wren had started painting in color again, and that Kate had started laughing again, the loose, unguarded laughter of a child who feels safe, and that these were not small developments, but very large ones, and that they had happened not despite the life she had made for them, but because of it. She said that her husband had known who she was, and she had spent the past year becoming more certain that he had been right. Judge Oates dismissed the Whitfield's petition on the record that afternoon. She did not make a speech about it. She said that the evidence presented did not support the threshold required for a custody modification, and that the court found the children's current placement to be stable, appropriate, and in their best interests, and that absent a material change in circumstances, the matter was closed. Constance sat very still when the ruling was read. Harlan put his hand over his wife's without looking at her. Nora picked up her bag and her copy of the file and walked out of the hearing chamber and found her children in the corridor with the school counselor, Cade, standing very straight with his notebook in his hand. Wren holding the stuffed owl against her chest. Both of them looking at their mother's face as she came through the door, reading it the way children read the faces of the people they love, looking for the information that matters. She smiled at them. Kate exhaled. Wren ran to her. She held her daughter in the corridor of the family courthouse on a cold December morning and looked at her son over Wren's shoulder and thought about Elliot's letter and about the judge's face when she read it and about Walter Briggs saying those steps are going to outlast the decade. And she felt the private solidity of a person who has been tested at the place she was most uncertain about herself and has not been found wanting. They went home. They ate soup from a pot Nora had left on the stove that morning. Cade did his homework. Wren drew something new light coming through a window onto a floor, very simple, very still. Nora sat at the kitchen table and did not do anything in particular for the first time in longer than she could remember. It was Walter who suggested 2 days later that she should go to the Whitfields. He said it the way he said everything important, simply without build-up, while they were replacing the caulk along the bathroom window. He said that he thought Constance and Harlan were people who had done a hard thing and lost, and were now sitting in their house in Greenwich with their grief and no way forward, and that sometimes the person who had won needed to be the one to open the door. Nora looked at the window for a moment. "You think I should give them something?" she said. "I think your husband would have," Walter said. She thought about that for the rest of the week. She called no one about it. She did not consult Conrad Ashby. She talked to Wren and Kate about it at dinner on a Thursday, explaining that she was thinking about visiting their grandparents, that the court case was over, but that the question of what kind of relationship they had with the Whitfields was a different question, and that she wanted to know how they felt. Wren said without hesitation, "I want to go." Cade was quiet for longer. Then he said, "They're still part of Dad." "Yes," Nora said. "They are." Wren asked if she could bring something. Nora said yes. They drove to Greenwich on a Saturday in mid-December, the three of them in Nora's car, with the heat on and the radio playing something quiet that nobody felt the need to comment on. Wren sat in the back with a flat rectangular package wrapped in brown paper, which she had been working on for 3 days in her room, with the door closed, emerging for meals, and saying very little about what she was doing. The Whitfield estate looked the same as it always had. The iron gates and the long gravel drive, and the pale stone of the house against the winter sky. Nora parked in the circular driveway, and they walked to the front door together, and she rang the bell. Constance answered. She looked for a moment as though she was not sure what the appropriate response to this visit was. The calculation moved across her face briefly, and then something else moved across it, something less managed, something closer to the surface of whatever she actually felt when she let herself feel it. She said, "Come in." They went into the house. Harlan was in the sitting room, standing when they entered with the careful posture of a man who did not know what this visit meant, but was going to receive it correctly regardless. He looked at the children with an expression that Nora had not seen on him before, or perhaps had seen and had not let herself acknowledge something stripped of its usual formality. Something that was simply an old man looking at his grandchildren and feeling the weight of all the time that had been mismanaged. "Grandfather," Cade said in the way he said things, direct and without ornament. "Cade," Harlan said. His voice was not quite steady. Wren stepped forward with her package. She held it out to her grandmother. Constance took it, looked at it, and then looked at Wren. "Can I open it?" she said. "That's why I brought it," Wren said. Constance unwrapped it carefully, folding back the paper with the attention of someone who understands that the wrapping itself is part of the gift. Underneath was a painting on heavy watercolor paper mounted on a simple board. Constance held it and looked at it. It was Elliot. He was standing in a yard that was recognizably the yard of the house on Elm Street. In autumn, the bare oaks visible at the edge, the October light landing across him in a way that was specific and real, painted by someone who had spent months learning exactly how that light behaved in that place at that hour. He was standing beside Walter Briggs, whose large, weathered presence in the painting was unmistakable, and both of them were looking at something outside the frame. And Elliot was laughing the laugh she had known by heart, the one that escaped him when something surprised him into genuine happiness. In the lower right corner, the painting in Wren's careful printing October, 6 months before. Constance's face did something Nora had never seen it do. Not the managed softening of a woman deciding to be gracious. Something actual. Something that moved from the inside rather than being arranged from the outside. She sat down. Harlan came to look at the painting over his wife's shoulder. His hand came to rest on the back of her chair. He looked at the image of his son for a long time. At the laugh, at the October light, at Walter Briggs standing solidly beside him in a yard that was not the estate and was not the world the Whitfields had built, and was unmistakably the world Elliot had chosen. "Where did you see this?" Harlan said. His voice was quiet. "This moment." "I didn't," Wren said. "Dad described it to me once. He told me about the man who had the house ready for us. He said they stood in the yard in October and talked for a long time, and he felt better than he had felt in months." She looked at the painting. "I wanted to remember what that looked like." Harlan straightened up. He looked at Nora. "The man in the painting," he said. "Walter Briggs." "Yes," Nora said. Harlan took his phone from his pocket. "I'd like to call him," he said. "If you'll give me the number. I'd like to hear from him directly." Nora looked at him for a moment. He was not asking permission exactly, but he was not demanding either. He was asking her to let him have this, to let him reach for the thing the painting was offering. She gave him the number. He stepped out of the room. Through the doorway, she could hear his voice low and measured, and then after a moment less measured, and then a silence that lasted long enough to mean something was being said on the other end that required listening. Constance had not taken her eyes from the painting. "He looks like himself," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "I haven't been able to picture him." Her voice was controlled, but only just. "Since November. I've tried. I can see him at the estate at dinners at Christmas, but I can't see him in between." She touched the edge of the painting, not the painted surface, but the frame of it. "I couldn't see where he actually was." "He was happy," Nora said. She said it without accusation and without gentleness, simply as a fact that Constance needed to have. He was happy in the life he chose, not despite what he gave up, because of what he chose. Constance looked at her then. The composure was still there, the architecture of it, but something behind it had shifted, and the shift was visible. "I thought he was making do," she said. "I thought he was making the best of something smaller than what he deserved. I never," she stopped. "I never understood that smaller was what he wanted." "He didn't want smaller," Nora said. "He wanted real." Wren had drifted to the far side of the room, looking at the family photographs on the console table with the attention she brought to all images, the habit of someone who understood that photographs were records of what people chose to document, and that the choosing revealed as much as the images themselves. She stopped at a photograph in a silver frame and stood looking at it very still. "Mom," she said. Nora went to her. The photograph showed a young Constance somewhere in her late 20s standing in a garden Nora did not recognize, holding an infant. She was not posed. She had been caught mid-motion, turning toward the camera with the infant against her shoulder, and her face had on it an expression that bore no relationship to any expression Nora had seen on Constance Whitfield in the years she had known her. It was unguarded and radiant and entirely present. The infant in her arms had a dark cap of hair and was looking at something above the frame with an expression of enormous curiosity. The infant was Elliot. Wren looked at Nora. She loved him, she said. It was not a revelation exactly. It was more like a piece of information that had been there all along, assembling itself into a shape Wren could hold. "Yes," Nora said. "That's why she's so sad." "Yes." Wren looked back at the photograph for another moment. Then she went back to where her grandmother was sitting and sat down beside her on the settee, without being invited, without ceremony, and leaned against Constance's arm with the natural, uncalculated gravity of a child who has decided someone needs company. Constance went very still. Then slowly, as if she had forgotten how and was remembering, she put her arm around her granddaughter. Harlan came back into the room. He had the phone in his hand, and his eyes were red-rimmed in the way of a man who has cried recently and is being precise about not drawing attention to it. He looked at Nora. Walter Briggs said my son came to his door in October, he said. He said Elliot spent 3 hours talking about his family. He said Elliot was... He paused, controlled, something continued. He said Elliot told him he was living exactly the life he had always wanted, and that the only sadness in it was the leaving of it. He looked at the painting in Constance's hands. He said my son was happy. The room was quiet. Harlan sat down in the chair across from his wife and his granddaughter and pressed his knuckles against his mouth for a moment and looked at the painting of his son laughing in a yard in October in the life he had built for himself. And Nora watched something in the old man's face complete itself. Some understanding that had been delayed for years by pride and fear and the blindness of people who love their children and mistake their own preferences for their children's needs. We were wrong, he said, not to Nora specifically, to the room, to the painting, to the accumulated weight of every conversation and document and legal stratagem that had tried to replace Elliot's judgment with their own. We were wrong about what he needed, and we were wrong about you. Nora said nothing. Cade, who had been standing near the doorway with his hands in his pockets and his face carefully neutral, walked to his grandfather's chair and sat on the footstool beside it. He did not say anything either. He just sat there, present the way a child sits with someone who is going through something and does not need to be fixed, only accompanied. Harlan looked at his grandson for a long moment. Then he put his hand briefly on Cade's shoulder. They stayed for 2 hours. Constance showed Wren the paintings in the upstairs gallery, including one by a 19th century painter who had worked in the Impressionist tradition and whose layering technique Constance described with a knowledge that surprised Nora and lit Wren's face with recognition. Harlan showed Cade the workshop behind the estate's garage, where he kept a collection of model ships he had been building on and off for 30 years. And Cade moved through the space with the focused attention of someone encountering a serious collection for the first time. Before they left, Constance asked if they might come for Christmas. Nora looked at the twins. Wren looked at Cade. Cade looked at Nora. Yes, Nora said, we'll come for Christmas. Constance nodded. She did not thank Nora, which Nora appreciated because thanks was not the right register for what was happening. They were not at the beginning of something. They were in the middle of something that had always been there, that had been difficult to reach, that was now slowly, with considerable effort on all sides, becoming accessible. At the door, Harlan said, the foundation, Elliot's work. I have resources if there are ways I can contribute to it properly. Through the board. Not to control it, to support it. He met her eyes. If you'd be willing. I'll talk to Conrad Ashby, she said. He nodded. He accepted this, the condition of it, the trust required. He did not push further. They drove home through the December afternoon, the light going early the way it did in Connecticut in winter, the sky at the horizon already the pale gold of late day by 4 o'clock. Wren fell asleep in the back seat before they were out of Greenwich. Cade sat with his notebook but did not write in it. He watched the landscape moving past. After a while, he said, Dad would have liked today. Yes, Nora said. Not because it was perfect, because we did it right. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. 10 years old, she thought. How does a 10-year-old know that? But she knew the answer. He knew it because he had been watching his mother figure out what doing things right looked like for a year now, on repaired steps and kitchen floors, and in courtrooms and in the sitting rooms of people who had made mistakes and needed someone to open a door. He knew it the way children know things when they are raised by someone who is trying genuinely and without performance to live according to the things they say they believe. She drove them home through the early winter dark. 2 years passed. The way years pass when you are living them fully simultaneously too fast and precisely measured each season distinct, each returning to something that was almost but not exactly the same as what it had been the year before. The house on Elm Street had become, by the second winter, the thing Nora had seen in it on that first afternoon, the possibility beneath the neglect, the house that the house had been waiting to be. She had painted the exterior herself in the spring, with help from Cade and a borrowed ladder from Walter, a warm white that made the dark green shutters she had added look deliberate and considered rather than merely present. The front steps were still solid. The garden she had planted in that first October, the small, ambitious garden that had seemed like an act of faith directed at a future she was not certain of, had survived the winter and come back in the spring, and spread by the second summer into something generous and real. Walter Briggs ate dinner with them every Friday evening. He had not been invited to begin this tradition exactly. It had organized itself from the fact that he was there on Friday afternoons to help with whatever the current project was, and on the afternoons that stretched into evenings, he had started eating with them, and the Fridays when he did not come had started to feel to all three of them subtly incomplete. He brought bread always, fresh from a bakery he had been using since before the neighborhood around it changed, and he sat at the head of the table, not because he had claimed the position, but because it had offered itself to him in the way of things that are simply true about a situation. He talked about buildings, about the principles that made structures last, the deep footings, and the quality of the materials, and the way joints needed room to move without failing. He talked about these things and did not usually say that he was talking about other things as well, and Kate understood this, and Ren understood this, and Nora understood this, and on the Friday evenings, when the conversation wandered into more explicit territory, it was always Cade who said, solemnly and with the faintest trace of a smile, "You're not just talking about buildings, are you?" And Walter would say, "Sometimes a building is just a building." And Cade would say, "Not usually with you." And Walter would not quite smile at his soup. Ren's work had changed. The shift had come gradually across the months of that first year, tracking something internal that expressed itself outward through image the way it always had with her. The dark storms and the failing foundations had given way to something more complex, not easier or softer but more spacious, able to hold more than one thing at once. Her paintings now contained both the darkness and the light, the storm and the house that held through the storm, the loss and the life that continued to be lived after it. Her art teacher, a woman named Patricia Odom, who ran the after-school program at Jefferson, with the serious investment of someone who had given the best years of her professional life to the development of young artists, had said at the spring conference that Ren painted emotional truths rather than surfaces, and that this was a capability that could not be taught, only developed, and that what it required more than anything was an environment where feeling things was not a problem to be solved, but a capacity to be honored. In October of the second year, a small gallery on the main street of their town offered Ren a student show in their front window, 3 paintings displayed for the month of October, with a small card giving her name and her age. The paintings sold within the first week, each to a different buyer, all strangers, all people who had walked past the window and stopped. Ren received the news with the quiet, wondering stillness of someone encountering something they had worked toward without being certain it was real until it was. "People I don't know will have my paintings in their houses," she said. "Yes," Nora said, "and they'll look at them." "Yes." Ren thought about this for a long moment. "Then in a way they'll know something," she said, "about what it felt like, even if they don't know it's me." "That's what art is," Nora said. Ren looked at her mother with the expression she sometimes wore when she was registering something she intended to keep. Then she picked up her brushes and went back to work. The Meridian Foundation, in its second year of active management by Nora, was supporting 17 programs across the state of Connecticut and the adjacent counties. Emergency housing assistance for families in acute crisis, literacy programs in 3 underfunded school districts, scholarship funding for first-generation college students, 10 in the first year, expanding to 23 in the second. An arts education initiative that provided materials and instruction to children in schools that had eliminated their arts budgets, which had been the program Nora fought for first in the first month, after she and Conrad Ashby sat down, and she said, "Here, start here." She and the twins reviewed applications together monthly at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons. Conrad had raised an eyebrow at this, initially gently suggesting that the children might be young for the responsibility. Nora had said that the children were exactly the right age for the responsibility because the point of the responsibility was that they were learning what it meant to have resources and to use them as something other than personal comfort, and that you could not learn that in theory. Cade had developed a system for the scholarship applications, a rating framework that assessed need and potential and the quality of the application letter with the analytical precision of a boy who loved systems and had recently discovered that systems could have hearts in them. He presented his assessments at the Sunday table with the formality of a small professor and then listened with genuine attention to Wren's counterpoints and Nora's considerations, and sometimes changed his mind, which Nora thought was the most important thing he was learning from the whole process. "This one," Cade said one Sunday afternoon, pushing a folder across the table toward Nora. The application was from a girl 2 grades above him at Jefferson, a student Nora vaguely recognized from the hallways, who wanted to study environmental science and whose family had been living in their car for 6 weeks the previous winter before a housing program had helped them find an apartment. Her essay was 3 pages long, and not one sentence of it was performing difficulty. It was just the truth written by someone who had decided the truth was what she had to offer. "Yes," Nora said without needing to read it a second time. Wren leaned across to look. "She draws too," she said. "I've seen her sketchbook in homeroom." She paused. "She draws the way I used to draw." Nora looked at her daughter. She understood what Wren meant. The darkness that was honest rather than ornamental. The storms that were reports rather than performances. Then she especially, Nora said. The scholarship went through. 3 months later, the girl's mother wrote a letter to the foundation that arrived in Conrad Ashby's office, and that he forwarded to Nora without comment, understanding that it needed no comment. Nora read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, and then put it in the recipe box behind the desserts divider in the same place where she had once found a cream-colored envelope with her name on the front. It seemed like the right place for things that needed to be kept. Constance Whitfield came to Wren's gallery show in October. She stood in front of the paintings for a long time, and the expression on her face was not the assessment of a woman with opinions about art, but the recognition of a grandmother seeing something of herself and of her son, and of a life she had not fully understood until too late in the one who had painted these things on heavy paper at 10 years old in a bedroom in a house on Elm Street. Afterwards, standing on the sidewalk in the October afternoon, Constance said to Nora quietly, and without looking at her, "She has his patience. Elliot never rushed anything he cared about." "No," Nora said. "He never did." They stood together in a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, which was, Nora thought, probably the right register for two women who were still learning how to be in each other's company without the structure of opposition to organize the space between them. Harlan had joined the Foundation's advisory board. He brought, as he had promised, resources and connections and a willingness to contribute that was notably free of the control he had once exerted without thinking about it. He came to the quarterly meetings and sat in the corner of the conference room in Conrad's office and asked careful questions and offered information when it was relevant and otherwise listened. And Nora had come to understand this as the form his reckoning had taken. The discipline of a man who had been told by his dead son and by his granddaughter's painting and by an old man's voice on a telephone that he had not seen things clearly and who was choosing in the time remaining to him to look more carefully. The painting Wren made of their family hung above the fireplace in the Elm Street living room. She had finished it in the 2nd December, the month after the gallery show, working on it in the evenings, with the focused quiet of someone completing something they had been building toward for a long time. She had called it complete in the small, careful printing she used for all her titles, and she had shown it to Nora before she hung it with the simplicity of someone presenting a fact. It was the 5 of them, Nora in the center, Elliot behind her with his hands on her shoulders, rendered in the same slightly luminous quality she had used in the painting she brought to the Whitfields' present, without being of the same substance as the living there, without being here. Ren and Cade on either side of Nora, smaller than they currently were the ages they had been when Elliot died. And Walter Briggs to the right, solid and real and exactly himself, standing slightly apart in the way of a man who understood that his place in this family was specific and chosen and not in need of ceremony. 5, Nora said when she first saw it. 5, Ren confirmed. She hung it above the fireplace where the lamplight reached it in the evenings, and on the Friday nights when Walter came with his bread and sat at the head of the table, the painting was visible through the doorway from where he sat, and he looked at it sometimes briefly with the expression of a man encountering something that surprised him with its accuracy. On a Friday evening in the 2nd December after dinner, while Cade was working on the scholarship framework at the kitchen table, and Wren was drawing in the living room, and the lamp was on, and the old house was warm around them, Nora sat on the front steps. The December air was cold enough to see her breath. The street was quiet in the way streets are quiet when the people in them have settled into their lives rather than waiting for them to begin. She had the ring on her finger where it would stay. She ran her thumb across the small ridge on the inner band, the character mark the jeweler had called an imperfection and Elliot had called proof. She thought about this library, the third-floor reading room on a Friday evening in September 19 years ago. The man who had walked in with a drafting portfolio and said she was in his spot. The life that had started in that room and moved through graduate school, in a botanical garden wedding, in a small house in a garden, in 4 years of secret philanthropy, in 14 months of illness, in 1 November, in an eviction, in a key on a metal ring, in a house that needed work, in 3 jobs, and repaired front steps in a file Elliot had built in his final months for a courtroom he hoped would not convene and one that did, and a painting of October light in a sitting room in Greenwich where an old man had cried on the phone and an old woman had finally held her granddaughter without agenda. She thought about all of it, and it did not feel like loss. It felt like a life, the fullest possible definition of the word, the kind of life that had been built not from the absence of difficulty, but from the decision made daily to be equal to whatever the difficulty was. She had been equal to it. She thought about something Walter had said the previous spring on a Tuesday afternoon when they were repainting the porch railing, and Cade was at his math competition, and Wren was at her art program, and the street was quiet and warm. He had been working in his steady, methodical way, and without looking up from the brush, he had said, "Elliot told me something the day we met. He said the thing he was most certain of in his life was that he had married exactly the right person. He had kept painting. I thought you should know that, in case it was useful." She had not answered right away. She had kept painting too because that was the right response to a thing like that, to acknowledge it by continuing the work. "It's useful," she had said after a while. He had nodded. They had kept painting. Now she sat on the step she had repaired with her own hands on a Sunday morning in October of a year that had asked everything of her and gotten it, and she breathed the cold air, and she thought about the ring and the library and the recipe box, and the painting above the fireplace, and the garden that had come back in spring, and the children inside the warm house behind her, and she was not waiting for anything. Through the front door came the sound of her children. Cade's voice explaining something with characteristic precision, and Wren's reply, and below both of them, the low sound of Walter's almost laughter, not quite a laugh, but the thing that lived just before one, the sound a man made when he was somewhere he belonged, and something had just surprised him into feeling it. The front steps held. Nora sat in the December dark and turned the ring and thought about what Elliot had called it when the jeweler apologized for the imperfection. He had said, "Do not apologize for that." He had said that is the best part. He had taken the ring and looked at the small ridge of gold and said, "That is proof that nothing worth having was ever perfectly smooth." And then he had put it on her finger himself right there in the jewelry store, not waiting for the wedding, because he had decided he did not want to wait another day to be the kind of person who had put that ring on that hand. She had married a man who did not wait to be the person he had decided to be. She was raising 2 children who were learning not to wait either. She looked at the ring in the December light. She was already there.